This evening I'm going to talk mostly about the free hunters who were in the fur trade, who they were, how they made their living, and we're certainly going to talk about beaver. I'd like to, after I speak, throw it open for questions. Part way through the presentation we're going to look at a video. You're going to see a beaver actually trapped, and how the pelt was prepared, and how some trades were made in the field. And so our journey really begins in the summer of 1806 on the head of the North Saskatchewan River from Rocky Mountain House. Jocko Finley, who was a free hunter, he was a mixed blood, he was half Cree and half Irish. He led a group of free hunters, was assigned to clear the trail down the west side of the Rockies, down the Blaeberry River, to prepare a way for David Thompson to come the following spring and bring the fur trade across the mountains into the Columbia. Well, as it turned out, when Thompson and his crew with free hunters started over the mountains, by the time they got to Blaeberry River, with the winter downfall and everything, the trail was pretty much, it was in a mess, and they had to cross the Blaeberry River many times. David Thompson had his Cree wife and 3 children with him, and so in his journal, he said he was very upset with Jocko Finley. But if you think about it, in the winter, most of the timber up there was thick lodgepole pine, and during the winter, there's going to be a lot of stuff come down again. So it really wasn't all Jocko's fault. Well, the point is that David Thompson built the first trading post, called it Kootenai House, in the head of the Columbia River. With David Thompson was Finan MacDonald, a Scottish clerk that spent many years in the fur trade. There were also 20 free hunters and engagés who paddled the canoes and helped with the horses. Jocko and the other free hunters, they were already in the country trapping beaver. And so who were these free hunters? Well, some were Eastern Indians, mostly Iroquois, who had been dispossessed from their lands via the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and American and Canadian colonial expansion. As a result, many of these Indian families lived in enclaves from the St. Louis Valley west to areas around the Great Lakes, and many made their living by a combination of subsistence farming, hunting, and trapping. These young Indian men were looking for adventure and happy to sign on with the Northwest Company to make money trapping beaver in the new Western Territory. Then there were the French Canadians. These were a diverse group of people made up of men from eastern Canada, northeastern United States, who were cueilleurs de bois, or one-time Quebec farm boys who had become voyageurs and were looking for adventure. The loss of New France to the British after the French and Indian War, coupled with the beaver being trapped out and the resource in that lower Canada area, pushed the fur trade further and further to the west. Many of the canoe paddlers, tired of carrying 180-pound loads, paddling 16 hours a day, and being cold and wet, became free hunters with the Northwest Company. But they still got cold and wet. The Métis were children born into the fur trade by Indian marriages with the traders and other fur trade personnel, including free hunters. These men and women grew up in the fur trade. There were also Hawaiians. At the time, they were called Awahis. The Hawaiians were hired by the Pacific Fur Company in 1811 when they were building Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River. During the Snake Country Brigade of 1832. This was when the brigades came up the Snake River and into the headwaters to trap beaver, and 2 of the Owyhees were lost on a river, never found. Today that river is named the Owyhee River, and one of the largest counties in Idaho is Owyhee County. The free hunters and their families traveled trapping beaver along the rivers in what is now northern Idaho and eastern Washington. They made most of their living trading beaver pelts and supplying buffalo pemmican to the Northwest and Hudson's Bay trading posts to pay off supplies that had been given them on credit. And so what did they have in common? All were French speakers. That was the working language of the fur trade, and spoke their native languages as well. They all worked their way west in some aspect of the fur trade and had the necessary wilderness subsistence skills to make a living as a free hunter. Most all were strong in the Catholic faith, French Canadian, Métis, Iroquois alike. Most families had been in the faith for at least 100 years. Many were married to Indian and Métis women, and their families traveled with them. And so the value of the beaver pelt was for gentlemen's top hats and military hats of the time. It was the soft under fur, this dark fur that you see, that could be felted into a hat cloth that was completely waterproof, and it was then and today is still the best fur felt in the world. And so that's what drove the fur trade, and I would contend that the beaver probably was the cause of the expansion of the Europeans, if you will, eventually into the Northwest. They were following the beaver they were following the beaver for the beaver's value. And so at this point we have a video, Coin of the Realm, that we'd like to show, and this gets right at the beaver trapping.
In the spring of 1810, David Thompson, a partner in the Canadian Northwest Company, engaged Jocko Finley, a free hunter who had worked both for the company and Thompson for many years, to build a trading post central to the Spokane tribe. The selected site was Nemchensen, the gathering place, the main fishing camp of the Middle Spokane people at the junction of the Spokane and Little Spokane rivers. During the next 15 years, this site served as the economic hub of the Columbia District fur trade. In 1812, the Pacific Fur Company, an American venture, built their own trading posts next to Spokane House and at other locations to compete head-to-head with the Northwest Company for the beaver fur trade. In the fall of 1813, the Northwest Company bought out the Americans and moved into their bigger and better fortified Spokane House post. Ross Cox, a Pacific Fur Company clerk, was at Spokane House in 1813 and later wrote some general descriptions of activities around the post. Outside of the salmon season, Cox said that the men lived principally on deer, trout, and carp, and occasionally killed a fat horse as a substitute for beef. By 1815, the supply line shifted to the Columbia River. The pelts went downstream to Fort George, previously Astoria, and from there were shipped to England and China. The China trade was mainly for tea, silk, and opium. The trade goods were shipped from England to Fort George for distribution up the Columbia to the inland posts. As the Hudson's Bay Company absorbed the Northwest Company business operations between 1819 and 1821, many of the men simply switched companies, and the post continued to operate in much the same manner. The only surviving Spokane House journal, from the outfit of 1822-23, describes men, women, and children tending a potato garden outside the stockade, an active blacksmith and pit saw, tribal and fur trade salmon weirs on the Little Spokane River, and an ambitious remodeling project on the buildings and palisade. Beginning in 1818, Donald Mackenzie led a series of ambitious Snake River expeditions south from Spokane House through the Walla Walla country. The 1822 annual report describes a snake country venture led by Finan McDonald that left Spokane House with 51 men, including many Hawaiians. Over the next 10 years, these annual expeditions were staged from Fort Walla Walla and expanded into Oregon, Utah, Nevada, and California. The Spokane House journal keepers noted extensive tribal movements both around the trade house and on regular annual rounds during the course of the year. Visiting tribes included the Spokane, Colville, Lakes, Coeur d'Alene, Kalispell, Kootenai, Flathead, Okanagan, and Nez Perce. While beaver, muskrat, and other pelts were traded by the Indians, they also traded horses, fish, fresh deer meat, and berries for beaver credits at Spokane House. If the Beavers' Lodge was its castle, then the waterways were its kingdom. When Europeans discovered that the underfur of the beaver's pelt was excellent for making hats, then the beaver became the basis for the entire economy of the region. Beaver fur is to this day the best fiber for hat material. Both gentlemen's top hats and military hats of felted beaver fur were very much in demand from the middle 1600s to the middle 1800s. French-Canadian, Iroquois, and Métis trappers known as beaver hunters made their living by traveling with the Northwest Company across Canada and into the Oregon Territory, producing over half the beaver pelts for the company in the Upper Columbia District. While a few men brought their Cree wives and children with them, many more married local Salish women and settled permanently in the inland Northwest, making the production of furs for trade a family operation. Beaver trapping was hard work and done in all kinds of weather. As there were no rubber boots in the early 1800s, the trappers had to get wet, wading in the water to set the traps and retrieve their catch. They usually wore knee breeches, and when trapping, encased their lower legs in thick blanket wool with an outer pair of buckskin moccasins. The trappers knew that wool, even when wet, was a good insulator, but still had to endure nearly frozen feet at times. The beaver and other fur bearers, after being caught, were skinned rough in the field to cut down on weight for transportation back to camp. The trapping families would have a main camp, and the men would go out from there up various streams looking for beaver sign. They were always looking for beaver dams and lodges that could be seen at a distance. The trappers were also searching for beaver slides, those trails where the beaver went out of the water to either make a scent mound or cut brush for food. This was the prime location to set a trap. The beaver hunters' wives and younger children would stay in camp, mending clothing, preparing hides, and doing other chores. Everyone shared in the camp life. The beaver hunters and their families traveled mostly on horseback throughout the inland Northwest. As there were no matches in the early 1800s, Europeans started fires with sparks made by striking flint and steel together. Steel strikers quickly became an important trade item with the Indian people. For the beaver hunter, being able to start a fire in cold, wet weather was his most important survival skill. During the trapping season, beaver meat was often made into a stew for a main meal, both morning and evening. Depending on location and season, a variety of roots and berries might be added to the beaver stew. Pacific Fur Company clerk Ross Cox mentions in his journal that our principal subsistence while in the woods was horseflesh and boiled rice. Since rice was a trade item at Spokane House, it might also be boiled with beaver meat. Wheat flour was also available as a trade item and often simply mixed with water to make a dough, then baked or fried. These small bannocks might be called hardtack today. The bannocks, if kept dry, would not spoil and made a good trail food. Beaver pelts had to be scraped of their flesh and then laced on hoops for drying to keep from spoiling. Stems of local woods such as willow, serviceberry, and mountain maple were bent into hoops for stretching the beaver pelts. Lacing materials could range from codline, a trade item, to rawhide thongs. These dried pelts, once traded, were baled into 90-pound packs and shipped, prior to 1813, back across Canada to Lake Superior, then to Montreal, and on to England.
Lads and lassies, tobacco on the prairie! Trading will commence.
Tobacco was essential for conducting fur trade business. No trades were made without tobacco provided by the trader. Ross Cox tells of how tobacco prompted a 72-mile horse race between the Northwest Company and the Pacific Fur Company to reach a large party of Flathead Indians with a quantity of valuable skins. Cox states, whichever of them got the first supply of that article would, by treating the Indians to a grand smoking match, succeed in getting the produce of their hunt. Cox, riding a horse named Le Bleu, won the race for the Pacific Fur Company. In the camps, trades might be made using bales of trade goods as a counter. Pelts for trade were brought to the company clerk to be evaluated for Maine beaver credits. Having established their value, a mix of trade goods was haggled between clerk and trapper. The standards of trade for 1824 at Spokane House give us the value, in made beaver, for many of the trade goods. Some examples include awls for sewing per dozen, 1 made beaver; gun flints per dozen, 1 made beaver. Beeves, blue and white, strung, per pound, 6 made beaver. Knives, butcher and clasp, 1 made beaver. Tobacco twist, per pound, 2 made beaver. Blankets, plain, 3 points, each 6 made beaver. Northwest trade gun, 18 made beaver. A trapper might not expend all his beaver credits at a particular trade. A beaver hunter might also ask for a certain quantity of trade goods on credit against his next season's fur catch. When the trade was made, the trade goods were taken off the counter by the trapper. The clerk took possession of the pelts, and a good deal ended with a handshake. The company, besides trading for beaver and other pelts, also traded for horses and food supplies with the trappers and Indian tribes. All goods were valued in beaver pelt credits. Everyone knew that a stretched, dried, ready for packing pelt equaled 1 made beaver, the coin of the realm. Each fur-bearing animal had a pelt value equivalent in made beaver. Using the 1824 Standards of Trade for Spokane House as a reference, it took the following number of pelts to equal 1 made beaver in value: 2 small beaver, 1 large land otter, 10 muskrat, 4 mink, or 3 marten. Tanned hides of large game animals also had made beaver credit values. A tanned deer was worth 2 made beaver at Spokane House. Lead was an essential trade item for molding bullets for the trappers' firearms. This commonly came in 1-pound bars, valued at 1 made beaver per bar. Hunters could easily cut up the lead in pieces that were placed in a ladle and melted over a campfire. The molten lead was then poured into a mold, producing a round ball. The lead left in the pouring channel, called the sprue, was then cut off. Typically, between 10 and 20 bullets would be molded at a time. The beaver hunters had to feed themselves and their families by living off the land, and firearms were essential for procuring meat. They were rarely used in self-defense. The beaver trapper's hunting pouch had to carry all the necessary accessories for the loading, cleaning, and field repairs of his firearm. This might include a screwdriver, ball puller, ball patches, bore cleaning material, extra flints, and a supply of lead balls. A smart beaver trapper would also carry extra frizzen and mainsprings. Gunpowder was most often carried in a horn, which quite often came from a bison. Lead shot, when used in the trade guns and fowling pieces, might be put in a leather pouch with a stopper in the end and shoulder carrying strap. The firearms, as well as gunpowder, shot, lead for bullets, and gun flints were trade items, all traded for beaver pelts. Competition between the Northwest Company and the Pacific Fur Company was keen, and clerks from both companies would go into the field to try and beat each other to the trappers bringing in the pelts for trade. In the spring of 1826, the Hudson's Bay Company replaced Spokane House with a new trading post above Kettle Falls on the Columbia River, named Fort Colville. Fort George, formerly Astoria, was also abandoned, and Fort Vancouver was built some 60 miles up the Columbia. The Columbia River now became the fur trade highway from Fort Colville to Fort Vancouver in the Pacific Ocean. Jocko Finley, the first citizen of Spokane House, continued to live at the abandoned post with his Spokane wife, Tishwentachina, and family. He died in 1828 and was rumored to be buried under the southeast bastion of the trading post. Following Finley's death and his family's departure, Spokane House rapidly fell into disrepair. As the land was tilled for agricultural crops, almost all surface traces of the fort were destroyed. All visible signs of the Indian campsites have also been lost. In time, the lower, middle, and upper bands of the Spokanes were removed to their modern-day reservation, north and west of the confluence of the two Spokane rivers. The first archaeological dig at the Spokane House site was in 1952 and 53. The objective was primarily to locate fort palisade walls. During this exploration, a grave found beneath the southeast bastion was confirmed to be that of Jocko Finley. A second archaeological dig in 1962 and 63 determined the location of some of the buildings and their uses. In 1976, Jocko's remains were reburied under the bastion with a marker placed by his descendants. Today, the palisade locations for the 1812 Pacific Fur Company post and subsequent expansions by the Northwest and Hudson's Bay Companies are marked by color-coded iron rails. The original 1810 Northwest Company trading post site has not as yet been located. This area has a long and rich history, starting with the Spokane people and other tribes who gathered here to fish and trade. The fur trade brought European contacts with the Indian people and manufactured items such as metal, cloth, and ceramics to barter for beaver and other animal pelts. Today, the Spokane House site lies within Riverside State Park. An interpretive center just south of the trading post displays many of the artifacts from the archaeological digs. A model of Spokane House as it existed in 1823 is also on display. The landscape of open bunchgrass and ponderosa pine forest looks much the way the first white visitors described it when they came to Nimchinsen 2 centuries ago.
And so it was alluded earlier that the beaver trapping operation is very much a family operation. The men with their wives and children would trap in groups of maybe 6 families or so. For example, maybe they would start trapping on the Coeur d'Alene River and work their way up. There were 2 trapping seasons, one in the spring and one in the fall. And in the winter, the families, then the men would generally winter with their wives' tribes. And so it was very much a family operation, and it was already mentioned, you know, the women were good at fleshing and stretching the pelts. The children, as they got older, they helped with the trapping, helped with the horses. They would augment what was a pretty steady diet of beaver. Maybe they would be fishing. They'd have some trout. Certainly later in the fall, why the kids might be setting some snares for snowshoe hares. And so the notion of this lone trapper out in the woods is not true. It was very much a family operation, and the women were needed. They were essential to make that trapping successful. And so when we get to most of the free hunters, their equipment and supplies were sold to them, as I had said earlier, on credit. And they were sold at an agreed-to price. When the man would trade for supplies, they knew what they were going to get for each beaver pelt. Some of the men in the fur trade were also part-time canoe men, paddling the canoes, but they also were pack string wranglers. Periodically, the free hunters, being expert in these areas, were hired for specific trips by David Thompson. So these were multi-talented individuals who had worked their way west in the fur trade and had many skills besides just trapping beaver. They were also building contractors, if you want to think of them that way. Free hunters were hired to help build all of the trading posts in the Columbia District. Kootenai House in 1807, Kalispell House in 1809, Salish House in the winter of 1809 and 10, and Spokane House. Jocko Finley was hired by David Thompson to lead the project and was assisted by other free hunters and their families. That season, Finnan McDonald, the clerk for the Northwest Company, came to Spokane House from Salish House with 2 engagés and helped build Spokane House. Subsistence hunters for the trading posts. These were meat hunters. The trading post relied on both the tribal people and the free hunters to bring in meat and fish to feed the personnel, the company personnel at the trading post. It should be noted that, as Jack Nesbitt noted in the video, Ninchinsen was a major fishery for the Spokane people and the other tribes, and they would come in as the salmon came up the Columbia River. They would arrive going north first at we'll say at the Spokane rivers and Little Spokane rivers, and so in June, boy, it was big fishing time and drying and smoking the salmon. And then later on, as the salmon were going up further upriver, then there was this huge fishery and get together at Kettle Falls. And so the Spokanes and other tribes were able to access the trade goods via the dried, smoked and dried salmon that the fur trade depended on. And so in 1815, the Northwest Company decided to form an annual field trapping brigade of mostly free hunters to trap the upper reaches of the Snake River. And we've touched on this. The Northwest Company hired a large number of Iroquois to help fill the need for more trappers for this brigade. The Indians in the Columbia District did not buy into trapping, at least early on. They didn't need to. The fur trade needed horses, lots of horses, and as I mentioned, lots of salmon was a huge food stuff. You know, if you can imagine, you probably like smoked salmon, right? Most, yeah. Try it for breakfast and supper, day in and day out. If anything, the bill of fare there lacked variety. The first Snake Country Brigade was staged in 1817 from Spokane House, and in 1818, the newly constructed Fort Nez Perces at the mouth of the Walla Walla River then became the jump-off point for the Snake Country Brigade. Following the merger of the Northwest and Hudson's Bay Companies in 1821, the Hudson's Bay Company anticipated competition from the Americans coming up the Missouri River from St. Louis. Alexander Ross was Hudson's Bay Company Snake Brigade leader in 1824. His journal lists the following personnel: 13 gentlemen, these were the company employees, 11 engagés, these were hired company workers, 24 free men with 8 lads, 22 women, and 5 children. Ross also lists the guns and traps and horses that were given to the free men on credit. The journal gives us some insight into the challenges of the trip and the country and dealing with the free hunters. The HBC Snake Country Brigades continued well past the 1830s, competing with the Americans, being supplied from St. Louis. The Hudson's Bay Brigades were staged from Fort Vancouver, switching from bateau to horses at Fort Nez Perces. The free men were regularly maligned by the company managers in their journals as having a superior and arrogant attitude, not taking orders and trading away their supplies to local tribes, and not being dependable. In spite of the alleged shortcomings, the freemen supplied about half of the furs that were traded annually in the Columbia District from 1807 to 1845. This is supported by an entry in the Spokane House Journal from November 30th, 1822. Two men arrived from the Flathead quarters with letters from Messrs. McDonald and Kitson, the purport of which is that we have traded since arrival 1,669 beaver skins in Indian trade, and have received from the free men 1,549, of which were forwarded here with 1,400 skins and 15 bales of dried meat. And so, in spite of how the company viewed the free hunters, they were absolutely essential to the fur trade and have left many legacies today. Some of the tribes, particularly the Kalispel, did not like the free hunters trapping and hunting on their areas without permission. They didn't take kindly to animals being exploited in the fur trade in their territory. The free hunters, however, seemed to be better received by the Salish and Upper Pend d'Oreilles, as they were allies in the buffalo hunting and war with the Blackfeet. In spite of the mixed reception of the Iroquois and other free hunters, they readily married into the tribes and developed families and economic ties with all the plateau peoples. This is also true with many of the company managers who took tribal wives. And so, where did they go? The free hunters of the Columbia District, upon retiring, seldom went back to Canada, but stayed with their wives' tribes, continuing to hunt buffalo and trap as part of their extended family. Their descendants are members of the various tribes today. Others settled in the Willamette Valley, forming Métis communities, farming, hunting, and trapping. Their legacies today: the free hunters gave French tribal names we use today: the Coeur d'Alenes, the Pend d'Oreilles, the Nez Perce, and many other tribes elsewhere. The names of cities: Coeur d'Alene, Kalispel, and Boise. Many of the names for rivers, lakes, and mountains are with us today. Priest Lake, which is translated from the Salish word Kaniksu, Pend d'Oreille River and Lake, Rocher Peak, and Coeur d'Alene River and lakes. The Catholic faith influence of the free hunters with the plateau tribes helped bring Jesuit missionaries, the Black Robes, to establish missions among the tribes that are still here today. Much of the tribal members' families' genealogy has been recorded in the church records of baptisms, marriages, and deaths. There are surnames of both the free hunters and fur traders within the Plateau Indian tribes today: Finley, Lessart, Stansgar, Ignace, Pion, Louis, Dupuy, Flett, Pierre, Campbell, and McDonald, to name a few. As historian Jack Nisbet says, the last names in the Whelpinut phone book read like David Thompson's list of free hunters. And so I guess at this point I would be happy to entertain some questions that you might have. Yes?
Yeah, I was curious. My wife and I worked in the Glacier Department a number of summers, and while there, we were offered to go on a 2.5-day class about the beaver, and there were two things that came up that really surprised me and wanted to come across too. We hiked in from Marias Pass north, just a fairly short distance, and the beaver had built channels off of a stream, and they could move their brush more readily through the water. I'd never heard of such a thing, but we saw a number of them. instructor who, lady from Oregon, took us right through that. Have you seen anything like that?
Indeed, I have. The beaver, once they set up their beaver lodge, their home, they're reluctant to move, probably much like we are once you've settled in. And so they would be very good at making channels in swampy areas, you know, to get to further food. You know, the beaver live on the riparian brush. They love willow, cottonwood, and aspen. And so they will make those channels. And to continue a little bit, what happens when the beaver can't reach their food by still being in the water, one of those channels, they start making trails up the side of the hill to go get more brush, more food. And at that point, the beaver become very susceptible to predation. The beaver's protection is to be able to reach and get back into the water. So when they're out of the water, why then they become subject to predation from bobcats, cougars, coyotes. Yeah. So I have seen the channels that you mentioned.
Do you know of any that around here a person can hike to?
I would have to think about that a little bit. Bill? Yeah, along the Teepee Creek, my friend Bill here, fellow historian, along Teepee Creek, there are some nice beaver colonies, 2 or 3, and you'll see some channels in the big willow flats up there.
Okay.
You might get wet to really get a good look, though.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Other question? Yes, ma'am.
Mark, how do they shave the hides to get down to that black felt layer?
The answer is yes. The beaver pelts, first of all, from here went to England. They went more than halfway around the world to be made into these gentlemen top hats. Yes, the fur was shaved off of the pelt, and the guard hair was separated from the underfur. And I'm not an authority on just how they did that, okay? But the soft underfur then was put together. They would put it together. They used water, hot water, and they would make, if any of you process wool into yarn or whatever, there may be some similarities there. Well, they would wind up then with this dense underfur that they would then roll out and into what would be the fur felt that could then be further formed over a mold into gentlemen's top hats and military hats. So, and I would be at risk, I'd tell you more than I know if I said much more. Other questions? In the back, yes, yeah.
Well, how are you interested in like the fur trade and beaver trapping and all that? How did you get started into all of this?
Well, I was a forester with the Idaho Department of Lands, and so with 5 children, and being out and in my forestry work, I saw where there were a lot of beaver colonies. I trapped more than just beaver, by the way, okay? And so it was a source of supplemental income, and I was doing that while holding down a full-time job. So I was working in the country, and it was a natural extension then to do some beaver trapping and other fur bearer, coyotes. Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever talk about the hides actually being sold for money, for cash? Were they always traded, or were they actually sold for money once in a while?
In the fur trade days, the beaver pelt was the coin of the realm. Everything was in fact, I can give you some of the values, and so it was later, and I can't give you a specific date, but I'm going to say that probably by the 1880s, they were starting to buy pelts for money. But they were also trading, so it was a dual thing, yes.
How much did you sell your pelts for?
Well, the fur market is a free market. There's no government subsidies, and the regulations are at a state level that have to do with how you trap and how many you can trap. And so right now I keep tabs on the fur trade market, and this is a really big beaver. This guy weighed 63 pounds. Oh, yeah. Well, the landowner helped me pack it out. But a nice beaver today would be about $35 for one that a beaver that'll, when they measure a beaver pelt, they measure now they measure diagonally from a hind foot to a front foot, hind foot to and they add that together. And so if the beaver pelt will, if the two measurements together will total 65 inches, it's called a blanket beaver. And today you'll get about $35 for one of those pelts. The smaller pelts, of course, less. And a beaver pelt takes more individual work to get it ready for market than any of the other pelts. Yeah, so with the time I put in everything, I haven't even tried to figure out what my wage per hour would be. I probably don't want to go there. Yes.
Do the beavers multiply fast? You just hear there's so much beaver trade up in Canada, and I thought, I didn't know there were so many beavers around.
Well, the beaver, given a good habitat, and I'll talk a little more about that, the beaver will be, the beaver mate for life once they find, and the female will get pregnant in the spring, and in the winter they typically have 2 kits. That's what the little ones are called, kits. And so in the spring, the first family will produce 2, but it gets more complicated. So they stay together, and the next year they'll have another 2, but the 2 from the previous year, they're still living at home. And so after the spring of that second year, when the beaver are 2-year-old, the kits are 2 years old, they get driven away from the lodge. They get kicked out. And some of the beaver that I've trapped will have bite marks on their back or chew marks on their tail, and I figure that was a result of a protested leaving of the lodge. So, given all the food that they would need, what I just described was a typical situation. If the beaver are starved or perhaps otherwise stressed, why maybe they'll only produce 1, or maybe they won't even produce. The mom won't even produce a kit. So, if they have good groceries, why I just described what is typical if they have good groceries. Okay, yes.
There's a beaver hut on the end of Fernand.
Yes.
And what would prevent somebody from going and trapping that? We always go there and try and see a beaver, but we don't see them very often. But is there any law that keeps somebody from going in there and trapping them?
Not at that house. The trapping is regulated by seasons. It's interesting this year. The seasons typically for fur bearers opened up the 1st of November, but this year beaver, mink, muskrat, and fur bears generally opened up on October 15th. But to answer your question, no. Beaver lodges, of course, would be protected and could only be trapped on private land with permission. But the bottom of Fernand Lake, appreciate the bottom of the Fernand Lake is state land, from high water mark to high water mark. Yeah, so more questions?
How long will a healthy one live? I mean, if he gets a natural life.
That's a good question. First of all, the beaver are the largest member of the rodent family. I mean, you might have known that, but the beaver will always keep growing. As long as there's groceries and it doesn't get killed by predation, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. As to just how long it lives, I am not sure. I can't. They can live a long time. I would say 15 years would not be a stretch of the imagination, given that they have good habitat and a food supply. Yeah. Was there another question? Yes, sir.
Mark, there's a book out recently you can comment on possibly about beavers. It's become very popular. Are you familiar with that book?
Is it by a lady author who's from back east?
I've heard about it, and it sounded very interesting to read. But
yeah.
But
I've read a book by a lady back east who, she's a retired school teacher, and she was writing, and she lives on her property. There's a beaver lodge. There's a habitat, and she writes about that and writes about number of the men in that area trapped, make part of their living. This is in rural Northeast, one of those northeastern states, okay? But anyway, it's a nice version about the beavers as far as covering not only their lifestyle, but how the impact that they've had or used to have, positive impact on the land. And so I'd like to at least sum up this today. Where there's beaver habitat, we have beaver. But there's less and less habitat due to perhaps farming operations that have drained swamplands and increased the acreage of what could be a hay field. But also housing developments have encroached on beaver habitat where they want to be able to have a home or whatever on a lake. But so the beaver are so resourceful, and so where there's beaver habitat, we got beaver. And the beaver trapping is regulated by the Idaho Fish and Game Department. You have to have a license. Your traps have to be identified, and you have to have permission to trap on private land. Okay. Yes, daughter.
During the site, was there concern about beaver becoming extinct? I mean, you read there was, I don't know if there was a season, I mean, there were 1,500, 1,600.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of beaver.
So your question is, what about the exploitation of the beaver? The fur trade was ruthless. They were out to get every beaver they possibly could. George Simpson, who was governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, gave orders in the Columbia Department. He wanted to make a fur desert. Against the encroachment of the American fur trade coming out from St. Louis, the idea was to get all those beaver he could to limit and the American-based fur trade. And so at one point in the fur trade, by the 1840s, there were areas that were completely trapped out of beaver. And so today, to me, the beaver is an excellent story of recovery. Because the beaver, as I have said, where there's beaver habitat, there will be beaver. There are certainly not as many beaver today as there were, I'll say, even in 1900. And it has to do with what I said, the housing developments that are encroaching on the habitat, and in many areas, years ago, they were draining a lot of beaver land to make more agricultural land. Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to thank you all for your attention. I really had a good time.